It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS 101.1 FM, AM 1160. Our conversation with Jesse Washington is brought to you by Marcus and Mack, a law firm representing injured people. Jesse Washington helped out with John Thompson on his autobiography, I Came as a Shadow. And Jesse, it's so good to have you with us here today. This is a really, really special project, and I know it must have really touched your heart to be simply asked to work with John on this book.
It really did, for folks of my generation who grew up watching Coach Thompson win games at Georgetown, but more importantly than that, just what he stood for, how he made sure his players were educated, how he stood up for racial equality. To be asked to help him tell his story was a special moment.
John Thompson, of course, we think of him as that great big guy on the sidelines for Georgetown. We think of him, of course, in the terms of the Pitt Panthers and Georgetown and all those great battles they had down through the years. So much of his life had a racial component to it, and it was from the very beginning. And he makes that point very early in the book, that he had to fight and fight and fight for whatever was the standard he was seeking for racial equality from the very beginning of his life, didn't he?
Very much so. Coach Thompson was born in 1941 in Washington, D.C., and D.C. was segregated then. It was part of the South. And his father was from Southern Maryland, which was a slave state. So he experienced segregation at a very young age, being told that his family had to sit in the back of the Catholic Church. They were not allowed to the front. They had to take their communion second after everyone else. And in his young mind, he said, wait a minute, you're telling me that Jesus loves everybody, but we have to go second because we're black. And that was the birth of his racial consciousness. And so he says in his book, a lot of people said I was too racial later in my life, and they said I made too much of a big deal out of race. But where did I get it from? It was put upon me from some of my earliest memories.
And that being the case, as he grew up and watched the various forms of racism that maybe someone in our position here might not recognize, it was very easy for him to make the correlations that sometimes we might have difficulty with.
That's true. I mean, it looks different from the inside out, and he probably looked at it differently than even someone like myself, who was a generation younger than him and didn't experience that. Some of the stuff that he went through, we think of as in the very distant past, but little do we know that our elders lived through that. For example, when he was in the NBA, they had racial quotas. He was drafted in 1964, and there was an unspoken agreement that the most black players you could have on any NBA team was 4 or 5. It seems absurd to say something like that now, but that was the case. Coach Thompson did play for Red Auerbach, the great Celtics coach, and he was part of that dynasty there in Boston. He backed up Bill Russell. So what he observed in the 60s in Boston and how Red really tried to push the envelope and to help black players get a foothold in the league, when he witnessed Bill Russell standing up for himself and insisting on his rights, those two men had a big, big impact on everything he did later in life.
And Boston was an especially difficult place in the 1960s in terms of its racial history as well.
It was, they went through the whole busing thing and desegregation, in the early 70s. And it's a tough place to be a black player. There's some infamous experiences that the great Bill Russell had up there. But, one thing that Coach Thompson says in his book is that most black folks back then were conditioned mentally to accept these things. One of the things that Coach Thompson remarks upon that I found really moving was that his father could not read or write. He had to go to work when he was, 10, 11 years old and left school and didn't have a chance to go to school. But the tragic part of it for Coach was that they just thought it was okay to be illiterate. They just treated it like a normal thing, like somebody maybe who walked with a limp or something, And he said that's the bigger danger, to accept these things and to be trained in your mind to think they're okay. So a lot of that was in effect in the 60s in Boston. But as we saw later with Coach Thompson's life, he definitely realized that these injustices and spoke out very strongly and did change a lot of things.
The racial environment with Georgetown, and again, that's back in his hometown of Washington, D.C., and the players that he brought in to his Georgetown basketball teams, it was just a sea change for Georgetown University, and that was a difficult time as well. He had to fight that battle too.
The battles really never ended for Coach. I mean, Coach graduated from high school in Washington, D.C. in 1960. They had a great team, won 55 games in a row. He was recruited by everybody, but he was not recruited by Georgetown, his hometown school, because in 1960, Georgetown's basketball team was segregated. 12 years later, they asked him to be the coach. So if you think that the attitudes really changed all that much in 12 years, then, I got something to sell you. Mm-hmm. And so when he became the coach in 1972, Georgetown was deliberately trying to integrate itself. They looked around at the civil rights movement. They looked around at the riots that had ripped through D.C. after the assassination of Martin Luther King and said, we've got to do better. We need black people here. They chose to do that through basketball, which is a statement in and of itself. And they wanted to do right by Washington, and they felt a moral imperative to integrate their school, and Coach Thompson was part of that. However, to the extent that he integrated it and his team was very black, people resented that. People thought that his players didn't belong there. People thought that these black kids were academically inferior, overlooking the fact that every university in the country that has high-level athletics lets people in, lets students in, athletes, with lower grades than the rest of the student body. But when Coach Thompson did it, it was viewed as some sort of bad thing to help these black kids. So that was just the beginning of his time at Georgetown. And then as he went on and got more successful, the resentment grew. And people really felt that Coach Thompson and his players did not belong at a place like Georgetown. They didn't like the fact that they played aggressively. They stereotyped them based on Coach Thompson being a huge 6'10" black man with a loud voice. And it sort of just went on for quite some time. It was only later in his career that people really started to understand Coach Thompson's primary objective was education, and that he was one of the real moral forces for good in college basketball. So fortunately, that came later, and he became the man that we respect and love today.
Jesse Washington worked with John Thompson on his autobiography, I Came as a Shadow, just out. Now, a part of that battle that you were just talking about was Proposition 42. John Thompson really made the difference in Prop 42, that battle over Prop 42, didn't he?
Proposition 42 was a racially discriminatory rule, and it would have unfairly penalized black students who don't have access to an equal education. Poor people in this country, and this is what Coach Thompson says in his book, poor people in this country, regardless of their race, don't have equal access to a quality education. If you look at SAT scores, the biggest predictor of your score on SAT is how much money your parents have. And so when the NCAA tried to say that kids could not get scholarships if they didn't get a certain score, Coach Thompson knew that was wrong, and he boycotted 2 games. He refused to coach. He walked off the sideline, and that put a tremendous amount of pressure on the NCAA and forced them to take that rule back. And so nowadays, when you see, for example, the NBA protesting games, Coach Thompson was really the forerunner of all that.
John Thompson in retirement is not all that different from John Thompson when he was on the sidelines at Georgetown. He kept fighting the battles. It's just, he tells an amazing story, and he is so compelling that you cannot really put the book down. Even the title of the book, I Came as a Shadow, comes out of a sort of a discriminatory approach, which he found within his own family. And with his uncle. But it really does underscore the fact that John Thompson saw injustice and not only saw how difficult a problem it was, but decided that he was going to make a difference in that. When you went into the room and sat down the very first time to talk with Coach Thompson about this book, you tell a really compelling story about how Coach didn't hold back right from the very beginning, did he?
No, not at all. I think he was really testing me to see if I was up to it, to see if he was going to keep me around, because just because he said that I could write his book didn't mean that I could finish it. You know what I mean? Coach would make a substitution in the middle of the game if he had to. And so, the first time we met, he just immediately started these passionate, intense descriptions of his younger life. And it was a lot of stuff I had never heard before. And it was almost overwhelming in a sense. But, I asked good questions. And Coach Thompson considered himself above all a teacher. And so part of what he was doing was delivering me sort of a lecture and a lesson. And these are the instances that shaped me. these are the moments in my life that made me who I am. You know, if you look at this, what happened to me when I was a kid, then you can understand why I hugged Fred Brown after he gave away the ball and we lost the national championship game. Or if you look at this interaction I had with these teachers, you can understand why I walked out over Proposition 42. He threw all of that at me in an overwhelming fashion in the beginning, and he wanted to see what I would make of it. And, you know, fortunately, together we came up with the book that's out right now. And he was pleased with it. We finished the book before he passed away, and he was able to approve everything. So when you read I Came as a Shadow, people should know every word in there is what Coach Thompson wanted it to be. And I feel fortunate to have been chosen to help him out.
Why did he come to you to do this book?
It was a number of reasons. He had never heard of me before, you know, and I'm just a guy, and I have a nice body of work in journalism behind me, and the folks who were helping him put the book together brought me and several other writers, you know, put us forward as candidates. I think that he liked the fact that I played basketball and I knew the game. He liked the fact that I cared about things beyond basketball, that the reason why I write about sports is to show the bigger and more important aspects of life, beyond just the glory of a dunk or a touchdown. Coach Thompson said in that very first meeting, this is not a book about basketball. It's about all the other things besides basketball that are more important. And I said, I'm glad to hear that, Coach, because I wouldn't want to write a book just about basketball. So he liked that. I'm not going to fool anybody. One of the reasons he chose me is because I was black, and he wanted a black writer to do his book. Not that he didn't think that a white writer could do it, because he had many, many very close friends and mentors who were white people. The myth about John Thompson being a racist is one of the most absurd things that we reveal and just expose in this book. The level of relationships he had with white people, the love and trust and that he shared with them is very, very deep. So, but he wanted a black guy to write his book. You know, that's just Coach. And he would say periodically, yeah, you could write, boy, but don't think that part of the reason I chose you is because you're black. You know, like, you know that that's true. But he always made sure to compliment me on the fact that I also had talent, and that was the thing. The final reason why he chose me is Coach liked going with the unexpected, the underdog. Coach liked finding diamonds in the rough. And for every Patrick Ewing and Allen Iverson that he got on his team, he got somebody like a Bebe Duran or a Mike Riley, guys who helped him win championships that no one had ever heard of. And so he liked the fact that I was, you know, under the radar. When he was telling me about why he signed with Nike in the 70s, when Nike was just a up-and-coming, struggling, scrappy upstart of a company living in the shadow of Adidas and Converse. And he said, well, you know, I like the fact that they were scuffling around. They didn't have a big name. You know, they weren't a big deal. Kind of like why I chose you.
That's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. It is called I Came as a Shadow, an autobiography, John Thompson with Jesse Washington. Jesse, it's been a fabulous time for me visiting with you. I know how emotional it must have been when Coach passed away for you this past summer. But this book is a triumph, and people need to read it. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Have a wonderful day today.